The wayfinding landscape is changing, so welcome to Endpoint's Wayfinding Xchange Podcast. We want to connect with leading experts, tech innovators, and key contributors to exchange knowledge and innovation in physical and digital wayfinding. We want to shape the future of wayfinding through discussion, collaboration, and shared expertise. And this is why we have created this podcast series. Enjoy the episode.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Endpoint's Wayfinding Xchange Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Jan Weiner from the Psychology Department at Bournemouth University. Prior to joining Bournemouth in 2009, Jan was the principal investigator and held postdoctoral positions at the Cognitive Science Centre in Freiburg, Germany, at the CNRS in Paris, and the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen, Germany. He received his PhD in cognitive neuroscience in 2004 from the University of Tübingen, and we thought it'd be amazing to get a real scientist, someone who's into the data, into the research, onto the podcast, and see what we can learn and what he can share with us. So his research, and I'll let him explain in more detail, generally focuses around navigation and wayfinding, our key subject, and around the fundamental behavioural problems that involve multiple cognitive components and complex information processing. So let's dive in. Thank you for joining us, Jan. I guess the first place to start, and the place we normally start with our guests, is how did you get into the world of navigation and wayfinding? What was your journey, and how did you find yourself here?
Thank you very much, Gideon, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on that podcast. Well, my journey into the world of wayfinding was really gradual. And I always seemed to gravitate to navigation orientation projects. So I studied biology, and even as an undergraduate paid research assistant, I decided to study bee navigation. I then did a research project, still as an undergraduate, in Edinburgh, training sticklebacks to solve navigation tasks. I then did my undergraduate dissertation on fruit fly orientation. And then finally, when I did my PhD, I started studying human navigation. And I think navigation is such a fascinating, interesting field. It's so truly interdisciplinary. You can study animals. Pretty much any animal in the animal kingdom needs to orient, needs to find their way. You can study humans. You can study the evolution of navigation mechanisms by comparing different animal species and what navigation abilities they have. We've been speaking with computer scientists who are interested in biologically inspired robot navigation. GI science is interested in how people read maps, how they use maps, how they navigate. And then it has important everyday practical implications, of course. And you can talk to anyone in the world about navigation. Everyone has been lost. Everyone has their own experiences, and everyone seems to be passionate about navigation. So there's nothing not to like.
Amazing. I mean, when you talk like that, you realise what a truly broad subject it is. I mean, in your research, and I appreciate you've been doing this for many years, I mean, is there a particular area of interest, of research? I've read a long list of the papers you've worked on, and there seems to be quite a lot around aging and its impact on cognitive abilities. Is that a particular area for you, or is that just a recent addition?
Well, it really started when I moved to the oldest part of the UK, I guess, that I got interested in how typical aging, healthy aging, but also atypical aging, dementias affect navigation abilities. So it is a current strong focus of my research, yes. Before that, I was more interested in more fundamental questions around navigation. So, for example, we know that our spatial memory is hierarchically structured. We know this from a lot of psychology experiments, but being a biologist by training, I always thought, surely this needs to affect navigation, right? The primary purpose of spatial memory is to find your way through the world. So this is where it all started for me, understanding how we memorize different parts of the environment, regions, and how they affect our navigation behavior. But currently, a strong focus is on aging and age-related changes in navigation abilities.
And I mean, that's quite a strong focus, I guess, for some of our projects at the moment. Quite a number of clients are, there's an aging population. For many of our clients, they appreciate that much of their audience is aging and may have various experiments that affect their navigation. I mean, is there? I'm sure it's difficult to say, but are there generic things that we should take into consideration when perhaps designing navigation systems for complex places that take into account dementia and cognitive disabilities like that? Is it something you can pass on to us as designers?
Yeah, we've recently done a review of existing literature, and really the main focus was to understand how psychology can help to inform aging and dementia-friendly design and design guidelines. And if you look through the literature, you find that obviously of great importance are landmarks for navigation, for orientation. Landmarks need to be unique, they need to be salient, they need to be persistent, and they need to be placed at relevant locations, such as decision points, but also potentially in corridors. What's really important is architectural differentiation. We have run studies with older participants who we asked to learn a novel route through a retirement home. And they found we actually called the papers "All Corridors Look the Same." They found it really disorienting that all corridors looked exactly the same. And if there were corridors without windows to the outside, they got fairly easily disoriented. And we can explain this because we know that path integration mechanisms, so that you update your position in space during your travel, is an ability that declines in aging. So as you navigate through a pretty much featureless environment, you get very easily disoriented. We also need to take into account age-related changes. For example, our vision gets worse, our contrast sensitivity gets worse. So anything that we use or that should be used as navigation aids, environmental cues that should be used as navigation aids, need to be of high contrast. We also know that older participant or older people tend to look down more, potentially because there's a higher risk of falls, and they want to make sure that they don't trip over anything. So any wayfinding signage needs to be located at eye height or even below eye height. Signage is always useful. We did find that people that we interviewed in a retirement home said their initial decision to move into that retirement home was because it looked like a posh hotel. It was really nice. But then after a while, after living there for several months, they realized you don't really want to live in a hotel, right? So there is a big question around wayfinding signage. How do you design wayfinding signage such that it doesn't look like an institution? It can look like a home. But of course, in signage, you want to combine icons and text. You want to use familiar icons, especially if people have cognitive decline. Sometimes they have problems with reading. Sometimes they have problems with understanding icons. So if you have both of these elements on the text, it's important. Generally speaking, it is unclear how useful "You Are Here" maps are for older participants, but particular for people who show cognitive decline or have dementia. So there are quite a few studies that some of them we have done and other groups have done that show that "You Are Here" maps, especially when they are misaligned, and they are misaligned if north is not forward, are really difficult to interpret because you have to mentally rotate them. And even if you can do this, it seems to be easier to find your way if you have appropriate signage rather than these "You Are Here" maps. So those are just a couple of things that spring to mind.
I mean, that's really interesting. I think anybody in our industry is working citywide or in the public realm. The last, I guess, 15 years, the use of maps in the streetscape it's become a common tool that you see all over the place. And I think as designers, we've spent a lot of time trying to design those maps to be as clear and as legible as possible. And there was a debate many years ago about heads-up mapping. So do you rotate the map to the direction you're traveling, or do you keep a map north-south, which is, I guess, the normal way that we grew up looking at maps? So there's actual research on these subjects.
Yeah, there is research. I mean, not research that we've done, but if you have maps that are misaligned, so when I say aligned means that north in the map should be forward. And if they are misaligned, people have great problems interpreting the map and finding the right way. This is research that goes back to the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. We've done studies where we asked participants to learn a route through a virtual environment, a fairly short route with 4 or 5 intersections. These were younger participants. Then we had 2 older participant groups, older participants that showed no signs of cognitive impairments, and then 1 older participant group who showed the earliest signs of cognitive impairments. And the latter group had particular problems recognizing the route that they've just navigated if we showed them 3 different maps, and one of the maps depicted the route that they've navigated, the 2 other maps depicted different routes. And picking the right route was really difficult for them. Now, that's not quite what we are talking about when we're talking about You Are Here maps, where you study the map to memorize the route and then you execute the route. So we did a follow-up study in which we put participants into a virtual care environment, and we showed them a You Are Here map. We told them you are here. The map was perfectly aligned, and then we told them this is your destination place. Participants could study the map for as long as they wanted, and then they navigated through the environment until they thought they ended up at the destination point. And again, our older participant group who showed early signs of cognitive impairments ended up far further away from the actual destination than our other 2 participant groups. So these You Are Here maps, they require a transformation from a kind of a bird's eye perspective into an egocentric perspective. And this seems to be a process that is particularly difficult.
Wow, fascinating. So maybe now's not the time to delve right into that particular study, but it sounds really interesting and the sort of thing that we're faced with all the time. So I think the beauty or the thinking around maps is that you can put a huge amount of information on a map. To write in signage terms or in text terms would be quite overwhelming. But I guess what you're saying is the map has maybe some use, but you need to support that journey, I guess, with other reassuring, maybe potential signs or other things that help people on that route.
Yeah, maybe I should put a word of warning here that many of the studies I talk about are studies that we do in the lab in virtual environments. They are nowhere near as complex as real world environments. A lot of the cues, a lot of the environmental cues that are available in real world environments, we exclude because we want to know exactly what information participants are getting. So if you have a real world environment and you study a map, then you might pick up places along the route that you can use to reassure yourself that you're still on the right route, right? And these are things that we wouldn't typically study in the lab. So there is a big question about how, and this is something that I'm currently getting much more interested in, how these findings from our lab-based sterile virtual environment experiments translate into the real world. Of course, we also don't allow our participants to just take out their mobile phone and start the sat-nav system and see where they are and how they get. They are usually alone. There are no other people around. They cannot ask for direction. So we cut all of that out in our experiments. So how these findings really translate into everyday navigation experiences is something that is currently of great interest to me, but it's early days.
Very interesting you say that most of your studies are done virtually. I guess that raises, one of the issues we're all facing at the moment is, the proliferance of technology, electronic maps, electronic guidance systems, be it through apps or digital screens within the environment. I guess we fear that people are losing the ability to navigate using, I guess, traditional methods, landmarks, thresholds, paths, because we're relying so much on the technology. We hear the stories about people driving into off-roads and things because they're just blindly following the sat-nav technology. Is there any research studies around that, this idea of trusting the technology too much, perhaps?
I mean, this is not an area that I'm very familiar with. I know that there are a lot of discussions around this and a lot of discussions on how you would actually assess this as an experimental psychologist, I guess, because often we talk about generational issues. We didn't grow up with smartphones that had sat-navs on them. We had to use maps, right? Even on long car journeys, you had to study the map, and you may have had a passenger who studies the map and gives you directions. So we trained our map reading skills quite a lot. I haven't looked at a proper map for years, so we take out our smartphone. But how much it affects our navigational ability in terms of of, is there a new generation growing up, or new generations who just lose navigational abilities because they have their smartphone and they use smartphone. They kind of outsource all of these navigational problem solving to their smartphone. It's really difficult to study. You would actually have to raise a cohort of young people without smartphones to make a proper comparison. As you can imagine, that's really difficult to do. So it's not entirely clear to me how you can assess this scientifically to make a strong judgment of how much of our navigation abilities we really lose. Of course, you can study people in our lab-based virtual environment experiments where they don't have smartphones, where they can't use sat-nav systems. But then again, you need to compare it to a different age group, and then age-related differences in navigation abilities also come into play.
So explain to me, because I have no idea. You have a lab, you're doing these research experiments. Are companies coming to you asking you to do research in certain things, or are these self-generated experiments just based around what you're interested in? How does the whole research world work? So I'm sure ourselves and people listening might be interested. We live in an age where trying to convince clients that we know what we're talking about, it's a point of difference. And if we have data, if we have research to back up our understanding, then that pitch becomes a lot easier. So how do you go about doing a research project?
So there are different ways to go about research projects. So we do work with businesses, with companies. We currently have a new PhD project with a local NHS trust who is funding or half funding a PhD project. And this is going to be an ethnographic study. So the PhD student, she will embed herself into the hospital and will study how people navigate through the hospital, why they get disoriented, where they get disoriented. She will then do focus groups and interviews, both with staff and with users of the hospital, to try to, first of all, figure out what are the real barriers to successful navigation in hospital. Obviously, in hospitals, people might be anxious, they might be nervous. Just by the nature of it, you have many more older people and people potentially with cognitive impairments navigating hospitals. So the aim of this project will be to provide design suggestions to the local NHS trust, but more generally also design suggestions on how to improve hospital navigation, which is notoriously difficult. So this is one way that we work with industry or businesses, through businesses contacting us and funding research projects. We have research councils. Typically, this is for more fundamental research questions, for more theoretical research questions, where we write a proposal and we send it to a research council or to a charity that funds research, and it's then going to be peer reviewed by other researchers. And if it's good enough, and if one is lucky enough, it is funded, which allows us to carry out a research project that we came up with. And then, of course, we have a lot of students, undergraduate and master students, who do dissertation projects, and they are interested. They come with their own research questions, and we quite often try to convince them to do one of the projects we have envisioned. And then we work together and work on those research projects. So there are different ways of delivering research projects. But certainly we are always interested to talk to industry, to companies, to see what their questions are and to see whether we can provide answers. Typically, we can't provide the answers next week or next month. Research takes a long time, and it's more of a strategic investment for companies to develop the knowledge base that they can then later use in their future work.
Yeah, I guess that was going to be one of my next questions. Is I know there's probably not a typical length of time, but I guess going back to that joint project you're doing with the NHS at one of the hospitals, I mean that just sounds like the perfect type of research that we all need. I mean, how long will that one take? Is there a timeline on that?
Well, a PhD project is typically 3 years. In this case, the PhD project started in September. We're still in the stage of getting ethics approval from the NHS, because if you actually do research in the hospital, you need NHS ethical approval, which is quite a longish process. But we hope to start data collection September. Typically, PhD projects take 3 to 4 years. Well, then you get a PhD thesis. We need to make sure as academic supervisors that the scientific rigor is there. So these matched funded projects or these PhD projects project, there's always a little bit of give and take because companies, industry might want to have a quick answer to a question, but we need to make sure that the scientific rigor is there for the PhD student to then pass their Viva and get their PhD. There is also consultancy research, of course. So when a company has a specific question, very specific question that needs a quick answer, then there is a potential for these kind of consultancy research projects.
I know our director of Wayfinding, Alison, she has a particular interest in hospital healthcare settings. I think they are some of the most challenging environments for wayfinding for many of the reasons you mentioned. People are already often quite stressed going to a hospital. I think funding often impacts on the quality of the information and the maintenance of that information. There's a high turnover of staff, so there's training issues in there. So we're actually always working with NHS trusts from all over the country on their wayfinding challenges. So I'm sure she would love to get involved if you need to speak to somebody about current thinking. She helped develop the current wayfinding guidelines for the NHS. And like you say, we work in that environment a lot. You see some of our previous podcasts in this series, there are people who are trying to develop technical solutions, especially for healthcare environments to help people navigate. So for me, in our business, it's not often the most glamorous projects for hospitals, but I think they're actually, in many respects, some of the most important because literally poor navigation can be the difference between life and death. I know it sounds quite dramatic, but in other environments, people might be late for a meeting or get a bit frustrated that they can't find a toilet or whatever. But in hospital settings, there is actually a real fundamental problem often if it's wrong, even down to the cost. If you're late for a consultation, there's a bottom line cost to the NHS there. So the investment in good on-site wayfinding, I think, it can actually pay for itself. But creating that business model and having proper research behind it to make those arguments to trusts who are always worried about cash, this research just sounds like it'll be fantastic. I guess, like I said, there's guidelines in the NHS. There's lots of books that have been written in the past. I think one of the classic books that a lot of the wayfinding community refer to is Kevin Lynch's book, Image of the City, where he talks a lot about landmarks and pathways and these signals within the environment that help us navigate. I mean, do you know that book? Is that something on the navigation researchers actually refer to? Is it just something the design community reads?
No, that's one of the books that everyone has in their bookshelf if they do navigation research in humans. Yeah, absolutely.
And was any of that backed up by research, or is this just a lifetime of experience and he put it in a book? Do you know?
No, I don't know the details to be. I know that I used his book and some of the ideas in the book that really influenced my PhD work. For example, he talks about regions in the environment and how we perceive the environment being divided into different parts, and these parts are actually represented in memory. So one of the main questions that I investigated during my PhD was how we use this information in order to navigate. And we actually have used this also to help improve for the wayfinding system in a hospital trust. So what came out of this project, this research project, was that as we navigate and as we plan a route, we don't have to have detailed information available all the time, right? We just need to know the downtown area to the left or to the right, and then you make your movement decision as you navigate. Your navigation plan unfolds and you make more detailed information available as you go along. And similarly, we have used these principles to support the wayfinding system in a local hospital here, where they had different buildings. Each building had 10, 15 wards in it. And of course, on each sign, you don't need to know whether to go to ward A or B. You need to go left or right. If you know that this ward is in the particular building, you just need to know in which direction you have to move to get to that building. And once you're in the building, then you make the more detailed information available. And that helps to reduce the clutter on the signs. It helps people to find the information more quickly. Obviously, it needs to be an integrated system. So in your appointment letter, you need to provide the right kind of information that no matter how and where you enter the hospital, you have all the information that you need. But it's a nice example of how fundamental research can really be used to improve everyday navigation.
Yeah. Like I said, I think most of our industry uses Image of the City as like you say, the fundamental principles for approaching most of our projects, be they campus, single buildings, or citywide projects. I guess I guess it's reassuring to know that some of that's been researched and used as a principle for some of your research, because we're basing most of our business on it. But so that's good to know. So yeah, I mean, I think we could carry on for much longer on this subject, because it's for me, it's fascinating to know that there's proper data out there. I mean, we talked briefly before we started about design, data, research. For me at the moment, I think there's probably a big gap. It'd be great to try and close that gap up. Do you have any ideas, or how some of your research can end up influencing our design outcomes for clients in terms of navigation systems, design of mapping, design of signage?
Yeah, I think other than research that has been done already, fundamental research that has been done already, we are thinking about how that can be translated into improved design guidelines. What we as psychologists can do, we've got the tools and the methods to compare different designs. So we've worked, this is work that I contributed to rather than led, with Frankfurt Airport, and they've got a group that is responsible for the wayfinding signage. And of course, as you know, there is a certain corporate design that you need to follow. But they realized that there were certain situations in the airport or certain places where people tend to get disoriented. And in an airport similar to a hospital environment, people may be anxious that they are not getting their connecting flight. So you got to make sure that the wayfinding signage is intuitively, quickly to read, easy to understand. And they had different design suggestions, and they didn't quite know which one were the best ones. And of course, as psychologists, we can put this in an experiment. So in this particular case, we used an eye tracking study. We recorded gaze behavior, so what participants looked at, but also we gave them, for example, black screens and with a little writing on top saying, go to gate C14. And then we showed them a photograph that was essentially photoshopped with different designs of signage. And we just saw how long did it take them to find the right information, how often did they make an error, and what is it that they looked at. And so that allowed us to compare different design suggestions and allowed us to feed back to that design company which design suggestion seems to be, at least in the context of this experiment, the most successful one. So the group that I've worked with there continued working with Fraport, and they did also some studies then in the actual airport and took videos, because the signage just doesn't appear quite often. You're walking towards the signage, and airports are difficult as well because you've got all these shops and they try to attract your attention by putting colorful posters out and what have you. So the question of how to create the best possible signage is something that we as psychologists can help to answer because we've got the tools and methods.
I mean, we do that a lot in our projects. We had a discussion yesterday, very simple corridor with a decision left and right. And do you label these doors on this corridor A to F, from left to right, or do you do it from a more user-centered? Because you couldn't see the right-hand side, so it's A, B, C, and D, E, F the other way. But it's actually, we have a lot of discussion about that. And like you say, there's probably never a right or wrong, and we try and explain this to our clients. It's everyone has different abilities, everyone has a different history of how they interpret the world, I guess. And it's more about percentages. It's like, well, more people, especially within the demographic of your audience, are going to find their way using this type of method or this typeface or this colorway or this size of type or this lighting than doing it the other way. And I guess if the audience, like you said earlier, if it was an aging audience, then the design would be more successful if it was slightly different. Obviously, I guess with static analog signage, it's one solution. It has to fit as many people as possible. And I guess that's where, in the future, where things could be more dynamic, we could somehow tailor the information provision, be it maps, be it signs, be it apps, to that particular audience. I think be visually impaired, be cognitively impaired. So I think that's quite an exciting future for us, is that some of our design solutions can end up being dynamic and really tailored for a particular audience. I've actually got tons of questions, but I'm mindful of our time. We try to keep these to about half an hour. So, it'd be great if we could invite you back at some stage in the future, maybe continue the discussion. So, Jan, thank you so much for sharing some of your experience. I'd love to have you back on and we could maybe delve deeper into some more specific things. If anyone in the audience is interested in your research, where can they find it? Where's the best place to look for some of these studies?
Well, the best place to look is just to type in my name in Google, and the first link should be to our university staff website, and which has a list of publications, contact details, and everything that is needed.
I know there are a few people in our industry who are sort of designers of wayfinding systems, signage, etc. There's a couple that have done PhDs in the subject, but apart from that, for me it's fairly unknown. I was really surprised when we found you, and the amount of research and the amount of papers that have been written on the subject is just like, crikey, how did we not know this?
Yeah, I'm trying to talk to designers a little bit every so often because I think there is a real need to do a bit more research and to build up the evidence base and to really ensure. I understand that the design of signage system and other things is informed by good practice, is informed by what works, it's informed by artistic considerations. But of course, for us as scientists, we want to see the data that really demonstrates that these systems are supportive, that they are as good as they can get. So if you have a chance to talk about potential research projects around wayfinding signage or wayfinding, assistance systems, that would be fantastic.
If people are interested in commissioning research, again, just get in touch with you first and have a conversation.
By all means, please get in touch and we have a conversation. Yeah.
Superb.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to our latest Wayfinding Xchange podcast. Stay tuned for further episodes and feel free to contact us with any questions and suggestions for future episodes.